Let's talk about African violet care and repotting today. Quick review, they like temperatures in the 70s, mid to high humidity, damp soil, and bright light, not direct sunlight. They grow under lots of indoor light types. If they don't get enough light, they will stretch towards the light. Rotating them every week or whenever you do the watering is helpful to take care of that problem. And here's what the situation looks like. You've got a nice flat African violet here. You spin it around, all the leaves are basically at the same level. It does have a few extra things here we're going to be talking about later. But the light is coming from the top and it's been rotated and everything looks good. Now this one looks decent from the front, but when you turn it around to the back, you can see that all the leaves have moved towards the light. So it's facing the light, and the leaves on this side have short petioles, that's the little stem on the leaf, and on this side they're much longer and they're growing way up. So this plant needs to be turned away from the window, and then it'll have these leaves bend backwards and grow better. And then in the future, this one needs to be in a different location possibly because maybe it's too far from a window. So it needs to be rotated more often and it'll grow into a much nicer shape than the lopsided shape that it is now. It is important to understand African violet growth patterns and pruning. The growing point where the leaves come from is called the crown. As I explained in the Greener View gardening book, the location of each leaf is called a node. That's where there's a bud for a new branch or a flower. The space between the nodes is called the internode. On African violets, the internode distance is very short. They're basically packed right on top of each other. That's how all plants grow. There are buds for new branches or flowers at the base of a leaf. In the past, someone decided that African violets look prettiest when they have all of the leaves coming out from one point and no side branches, so they just have a crown, a single crown. There are botanical reasons for this, and I'll talk about those in a minute. When you look straight down on the plant, you see a small cluster of leaves in the middle, and then bigger leaves and bigger leaves in circles as you go outward, larger and larger leaves. Because the nodes are so close together, it appears that they're all in circular layers. To create this look, all the side branches are pruned away. And during this process, you'll see small leaf. If you're looking, you'll see like a small leaf like this one is growing under a big leaf. Then you go ahead and get rid of that one, like that. Just bend it to the side and take it off. Now, if you continue doing that on the lower leaves, you might end up with a long trunk, what's called a long neck. And it can be dealt with in a couple ways, and we'll talk about that in a few more minutes. From the plant's viewpoint, no one is running around Africa pruning the side branches off of African violets. The plants grew side branches that developed new flower clusters. The plants didn't stay single-crowned. They grew in a sort of bushy shape, like some of these over here. A bush African violet is using a lot of energy to create side branches. The end of the side branch will eventually produce some flowers, but there may not be very many flowers on each side branch, and they may be hidden under the leaves. You can see all this stuff is all packed in underneath here. By pruning away the side branches to create this single crown-shaped plant, the effect on the plant is stress. This forces the plant to go into a flower-producing mode that grows more flowers in the center of the plant where they're the most visible, and that's what we want. It's best to do this pruning while the side branches are very small. I let some of these plants grow for a long time, so it'd be easier to show you what I'm doing. I prefer small scissors or small pruners to cut off the branches without damaging the rest of the plant. It's wise to spray the tools with rubbing alcohol to help prevent spreading diseases. Some of the side branches will be close enough to the soil that they may have grown their own roots. They can be separated from the mother plant to become clones with identical flowers and leaves, and the whole plant will be identical to the original plant. This is one method of propagating African violets. The trailing varieties of African violets have long internodes. That allows for the side branches to eventually reach over the sides of the pot and hang down. The next thing to look at is the need to repot the violet. When your African violet is in a resting mode between flowering times, like these are, and you're not letting it grow more branches, side branches or new plants, like I have been on these, you can repot the plant anyway when it's in its resting mode. Many people believe that African violets need to be repotted every 6 months or every year, but no one is going around Africa digging up and replanting African violets. Now, of course, African violets in nature are not restricted to a small flower pot. If you see roots coming out the drainage holes in the bottom, it's time to replant. If you slide the plant out of the pot and it's all wrapped in roots, this one's not, then you would repot it if you see all those roots on there. If the plant has developed a long neck because the lower leaves have been falling off over the years, then it's probably time to repot that one too. As a general rule, we don't repot plants when they're in bloom. Repotting can cause the plants to produce roots and abandon the flowers. What kind of pot and how big should it be? You can keep the plant in the same pot by just trimming off some of the bottom roots or gently removing some soil and roots from the sides of the root ball. When choosing a new pot, don't go too big. Extra soil in the pot that doesn't have roots growing in it can stay too waterlogged. As I write in the Greener View Gardening book, plants use water 24 hours a day, but we don't have to water them 24 hours a day because the soil in the pot acts like a sponge. Dip a sponge in water and air bubbles come up as water fills the sponge. Pull the sponge out of the water and water drains out as the air drains back in. There is air in the large pores and water in the small pores that keep the sponge damp. This is what African violets want, a damp sponge soil. If water stays in the large soil pores, the roots can drown. The dead roots are then decayed by bacteria and fungi, and those organisms then consume live tissue and the plant dies. Even though the plant seems to crash and die overnight, the problem started possibly weeks earlier. African violets can grow in any pot with drainage holes. If you need the plant to be in a pretty pot without drainage holes, it's best to plant it in a pot with drain holes and then place that smaller pot into the larger pot that's prettier, that doesn't have the drainage holes, and that will act like a fancy saucer. If you use a self-watering saucer with a fiber mat for the pot to sit on, the drain holes need to be in the bottom so the soil can touch the mat to soak up water. If you reuse old pots, wash them out and sterilize them with a 10% bleach solution. Many people have found that a pot about 1/3 as wide as the mature plant works the best. So a 12-inch wide plant needs a 4-inch wide pot. Self-watering pots and saucers. Self-watering pots and saucers have some advantages. They keep the soil damp for longer times between waterings, and the water comes up from below, so no water gets on the crown of the plant. You can go on vacation and your plants are still being watered. Self-watering pots have some disadvantages. Depending on the soil mix ingredients, the soil can remain too wet for good root health. More perlite keeps the plant from getting too wet. If you move a violet up into a larger pot, there may not be any roots in the extra soil to take away the water, so you have to monitor the soil moisture until the roots grow into that new soil. Speaking of monitoring, don't forget to watch the self-watering pot so that it doesn't run out of water. I have 3 Moist Rite planters left over from my mom's years of growing African violets. These pots are from the mid-1970s. They work on a vacuum principle. Water fills a chamber between the inner and outer walls through the top hole that is plugged with a rubber stopper. 4 tiny holes allow water to seep into the soil area as the plant needs it. Without the rubber stopper, the water fills the area in the soil to the same depth as in the reservoir. If you're interested in these pots, there will be a link in the description. Chemical salts move up the soil when you use a wick type of self-watering. Every few months you should add water from the top of the pot to help wash these salts into the saucer, which is then dumped out. The soil surface on self-watering pots, such as the Moist Rite pot, may need to be scraped off and replaced to remove the salty soil. What kind of potting soil should you use? In nature, African violets grow in shady, moss-covered cliff cracks. This allows for fast water drainage from frequent rains. There is an accumulation of organic matter that is slowly composting in the cracks to supply nutrients. African violet roots are not the aggressive type of rock-clinging roots that you might imagine. They are thin and fragile. The soil in our flower pots needs to be loose enough for the roots to grow while draining water out quickly, and yet still holding enough water to be damp. Standard potting mixes may be too thick or become too compacted for the African violet roots, so special African violet soil mixes are used. Peat moss and coconut coir are both capable of being the main ingredient. Peat moss is mined from bogs, while coconut plantations are being blamed for destruction of orangutan habitat. At this point in time, it's hard to say which is more sustainable, but I lean towards the peat moss. You'll see many recipes for African violet potting soil. Most of them use about 1/3 peat moss and 1/3 perlite and 1/3 vermiculite. Optimara makes their own African violet potting mix after experimenting for several decades to get it right. They don't add perlite or vermiculite, but they do have small foam balls in the mix to aid in drainage. I think part of the reason for not having the vermiculite is that many people use wicks to draw water into the pot, and the vermiculite may hold too much water in the soil. If I was going to add anything to the mix, it would be a couple of teaspoons of composted organic matter, so there'd be more micronutrients in the soil, because typical fertilizers don't add them. If the soil mix you use has added fertilizer, you may not need to use additional fertilizer for several months. Potting soil does not need to be replenished frequently. Perlite and vermiculite don't degrade easily, and peat moss slowly decomposes. Peat moss is the dead and decaying plant matter in a sphagnum moss bog. Sphagnum is the live plant, and peat moss is the dead material from the sphagnum and other plants in the bog. As peat moss slowly degrades, it releases micronutrients for the houseplant to use. Potting mixes for African violets can also be used for small succulents like orthia, many indoor ferns, indoor begonias, windowsill pots of basil, oregano, and mint. Lots of plants will grow in this mix as well as African violets. After repotting care, if you removed a lot of roots during the repotting, it can be beneficial to place the whole pot and plant in a plastic bag to increase the humidity around the plant for a week or two. Do not place the bagged plant near a window since sunlight can overheat the bag. Propagation from leaves and from suckers. African violets are easy to propagate. At the same time, you should not propagate named varieties because they're protected by plant patents. Some violet hybrids are chimeras, which means they have two separate genetic structures within the plant, and so they may not grow into the same kind of plant as you expect because you may be just getting one of the genetic structures. Most plants in the world can be propagated only through stem tissue, but African violets can grow new plants using leaf petiole tissue, flower stalk tissue, and even just part of a leaf. Even after careful handling, a leaf may break off during the repotting process. The pruning process will produce many leaves and suckers that can be used for creating new plants. African violets can be easily propagated in both soil and water using healthy leaf cuttings. At the same time, African violets often grow more than one crown. A sharp knife can separate the extra crown from the original plant. If it has roots, it can just be potted. If not, plant it anyway. Firm the soil around the base and put the whole thing into a plastic bag to keep the humidity up. And that extra crown may grow just fine even though it didn't have roots to begin with. An advantage to propagating a leaf in water is that you can see when roots start growing because it can take a couple of months before you see leaves above the soil in the soil method. An advantage to propagating a leaf in soil is that you don't have to plant it when the new roots are growing and when new leaves start to grow. Select young but mature leaves to propagate rather than leaves that are old and may be losing their color or vigor. For variegated leaf plants, use a mostly green leaf, as a variegated leaf might rot before producing a new plant. It doesn't have enough chlorophyll in the leaf to begin with. When starting the leaves in potting mix, it is best to, if the potting mix is very light and fluffy, using this mix allows the roots to develop more freely. You can use just perlite or sand or vermiculite if you want to, or a mix of those. Do not set the leaves into the potting soil mix very deeply, since the plantlets will grow from the cut end of the stem. Setting the stem in just enough to keep the bottom tip in the mix makes a much shorter trip for the little plants to grow before they reach the light. Cutting the leaf at an angle face up will cause the new plantlets to be growing upwards off that cut edge. It may speed up the process of propagation to trim about an inch off the tip of each mother leaf, using a knife to slice it off. This seems to stimulate the production of plantlets and also increases the amount of light that reaches the soil where they're forming. Enclosing rooting leaves in a clear container or Ziploc bag increases humidity and warmth, while often results in faster growth. Don't give up too quickly on a leaf that isn't sending out new growth. Some leaves take weeks longer than other ones. The new plants can be separated from the leaf when the new leaves are about the size of a dime. And this is Jeff with a Greener View. Thanks for watching.